Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for Blue Water Cruising Association for hosting this event. So you got to know what your daily amp hour budget is, right? This number right here. And then the next question you've got to ask yourself, and this is really essential, is when's the next time I'm going to be recharging my batteries? Right? Think about it. I mean, are you lucky, for example, some people have a generator. They run the generator in the morning and the evening. Besides the fact of the noise and the sound and the vibration, for them, the amount of time that they need to worry about power is from the last time they run it in the evening, which is maybe 6 or 7 or 8, till they run it the next day in the morning, 9 o'clock. So maybe they're running it every, they're going to get a charge every half day. Some sailboaters, I even had a power boater come to me. He had about a 40-foot boat. He says to me, Jeff, I don't want to run my generator I have one, but I don't want to run it more than every 5 days. I want to be on the hook on my batteries for 5 days. Came from a sailing background. He's like, yeah, I've got a power boat, but I like quiet. And I have a generator, but I don't want to run it all the time. So we give a battery bank that allowed him to do 5 times the daily amp hour rate, right? And this is where the math comes in, and there's a method to this whole magic is, well, your usable battery capacity has to be what your daily amp hour budget is times the estimated time between charging. Think about traveling in the 80s, before maybe you didn't have traveler's check. You need to carry the cash you're going to have in your pocket. I mean, how else are you going to, if you didn't have a credit card, you're gone for a week, you got to need money for a week. And so if you're not able to resupply energy in your battery bank, and you're going to stay at anchor for 2 days, and your daily is, for example, 200 amp hours, and you're at an anchorage for 2 days, then you need 400 amp hours of usable battery capacity. And that's the method to what is perceived to be the madness. But it's not madness, it's just math. Question about what the ratio between usable and the batteries you need. And this is exactly where we are right here. So let's recap what we talked about. Flooded battery. The floor is 50%. AGM and gel floor is 30%. Firefly is 20. The ceiling on all these flooded lead acid batteries is 85. Hence, a flooded battery has only 35% usable. AGM gel is 55. And Firefly AGM is 65. This is sort of a recap of what we talked about, right? It's all about energy density. And the lithium would be 80% usable, right? That's why people do lithium. It's crazy amount of energy per footprint and for weight. The top 15% for batteries is what's called the absorption rate. The absorption rate takes forever to recharge back. You'll get there, but you have to be patient. And the problem is if you're underway with an alternator or you're recharging with, an alternator or a generator and you're running a charger, it's diminishing returns. The moment you get around 80, 85%, but let's call it 85, it's a really good battery. From 85 to 100 might take you 5x what it took you from 50 to 85. So if time is no factor and you have lots of time, i.e. connected shore power overnight, you'll get back to 100. But while you're underway, I have boat owners, they say, Jeff, it's taking me forever to recharge my batteries. I'm like, okay, when do you stop? When I get to 100. I'm like, it's like a marginal tax rate of like 98%. At one point, you've got to ask yourself, is it worthwhile for me to put the same effort I did on the first hour on my 14th hour when I'm only getting now 2% of the returns I did on the first hour? And then as a boater, you're like, well, no, that's kind of silly. Why would I do that? And hence, it's better to run within that bulk rate, right? Where you get the maximum amount of returns. And that's a place where you're not taxed. Once you get to 85%, it's absorption, and that means high tax rate. So you're still, you're hearing the engine run, your generator is running, all those noises there, but your batteries are saying, I can't do it, I'm full. It's sort of like having a 7-course dinner. Your first course you might be hungry on the second, the third, the fourth, maybe the fifth, but let me tell you, at the 6th course, you're slowing down. Like there's no way your first bite on the first course is the same as your 6th course. And if you are, well, you're still growing. Congratulations, right? But none of us, at one point, you're like, I can't do it. And the 7th course, when they take out the cheeses and they put a few little grapes, that's flow charging. That's you nibbling on the food at the table and sort of keeping up with, at that point, you could sustain that for a period of time, but you're just barely taking a bite. That's float. But 80 to 85 to 100 is absorption, and that's a high tax rate. I tell boaters all the time, I'd rather you, for example, if you have a generator, I'd rather you run the generator twice a day for an hour morning and night, so you stay in bulk, than run it once in the morning for 2 hours and then get to absorption, and then you have diminishing returns. We would do this in our normal lives, by the way. Like at one point you're going, well, it's not worth it. Like if I've got a 98% marginal tax rate, you're like, why am I working? Like I'm not getting the returns. If I wait another 4 hours and do it later, then I'm going to get higher returns. So you slow down, right? And you stay within that bulk mode. And that's what is you're calculating. So that's your usable battery capacities from 50 to 85, 30 to 85, and 20 to 85 for flooded, AGM or gel, or Firefly. Lithium would be 80%. You know, what happens if you go below 30%, you know, with your battery, for example, for an AGM gel? Well, it's not like 29 is like you're off a cliff. But don't get cocky. Don't start going 20. It's diminishing returns. There's a charge curve. Here's the example summary. You take a flooded lead acid battery, for example. At 50% depth of discharge, you have 300 cycles. If you bring your battery down to 0 every time, which is a way a lot of boaters do it, to be honest, I start charging my batteries when the lights go dim or my fridge stops. That's about 10.5 volts. When you get to that point, it's like, you know, when I decide to go to bed, this would be a perfect analogy, is when I am actually working and I fall on the ground and pass out. That's when I know that it's stopped time to work. And you could do that. You could, and that doesn't mean you're actually lying down. No, you're passing out standing. Like you're falling down, passing out, and you're like, oh yeah, that was a good day. You know, I feel pretty productive. And you're like, oh, next time, let's do it all over again. And then can you imagine? That's called a life event. Okay? If you pass out working, standing up, and you fall down, that's what's bringing your battery to 10.5 volts is. And if you do that, your battery is going to give you 50 cycles. So it's a ratio of 6. 15 to 300 is 6. And that's why people have battery lives that are so much shorter than others. What happens is they, unbeknown to them, because they don't have a battery monitor, they're taking their batteries so hard, and the battery's not complaining, right? It's sort of like my chocolate lab. She'd fetch until I say stop. She would never stop. She's like, hey, Papa, let's do this. This is amazing. Her hip is torn. She's like limping. She's like, this is great. Let's keep doing it. She would fetch until she dies because she's a lab. Your battery will do everything you ask of it until it dies. But then when it dies, also understand there's a cost implication in battery life. All right, does that make sense? You got a question in the back? The question is, what happens if you keep your batteries below 85% forever and you never charge them? You could not do that. You can't. That top-end battery will be lost. You need, and that's what happens with cruisers that go offshore. At one point, you need to find a way to get your batteries back to 100%. And the way to do that would be solar, for example, because solar works in the background quietly. And if you don't do that, which some cruisers can't, they didn't have solar, then you end up having to equalize your batteries a lot because of the sulfation. And so you read these how-to manuals, and people talk about equalization of their battery, and I'm not going to go there because that is a full rabbit hole, and I will have people running for the doors. So we're not going to do that. But you would equalize your batteries once a month to maintain that top end. Okay? Another question? So the question is, with solar, can you get to 100%? Yeah, if your array's big enough, and your array doesn't just meet your loads, but it surpasses your loads, right? Like we'll talk about solar, but yeah, solar would be a good way, because solar just works in the background. It's free. You know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't bother you. It's just there. You know, you use it or not. There's no noise associated. The challenge with an alternator or a generator is it's not pleasant. And if it's pleasant to you, I envy you. Because when I hear a generator or an alternator running, I don't care if I'm on a powerboat or a sailboat, it's not the most endearing sound of my life. I choose to limit that noise for a certain amount of time. And I understand it's the cost of doing business, right? But at the same time, I don't want it to be running in the background forever, especially if I have diminishing returns. We'll talk about that a little bit later because there's a lot of charging, and we'll talk about that. So this is sort of a summary chart of AGM, Firefly, flooded. And this gives you sort of all the things that we just talked about are sort of summarized. You'll pay more for better. Don't kid yourself. You know, cars are not priced with the least valuable car for the most amount of money or vice versa. If you want a better car, you're going to end up paying more for it than if you want, it's a choice. It's just a choice. Yeah, like for example, a flooded Group 31 battery, for example, is going to run you like a Rolls one. It's probably going to be $175 for a deep cycle battery. An AGM battery Group 31 is about $400, $450. and a Firefly is around $700, $750. So ratios. Same battery size, right? You got to compare apples to apples. You can't start comparing grapefruits to apples because then your whole world is going to become completely confusing. Yeah, question? Do all batteries come in two flavors of either sprint or marathon, either starter or deep cycle? Flooded batteries do. Absolutely. You can buy a battery, a flooded battery, as either starter battery, a deep cycle battery, or a dual purpose battery, right? Sort of like an all-weather tire. So there's three flavors for flooded. AGM is mostly, it's actually really good for both. But now they started making AGM batteries that are just dedicated for starter. For example, North Star has a really good high cranking amp AGM battery. And Firefly is only deep cycle. People come to me all the time, they say, Jeff, I want the best. We're going to do everything Firefly. I'm like, well, everything except the starter. Because there's no point in buying a Firefly, a starter battery. It's not good. It's double the price, and you don't need it. And like, but I want the best. I'm like, yeah, I know you want the best, but in this case, the best for starter is less. So we're going to spend less money on a starter battery because your Firefly battery is just not going to be as good for a starter application. It's a deep cycle battery. AGM batteries have basically a 50% longer life at the maximum depth of discharge than a flooded battery. So you can trade off cycle life versus depth of discharge, right? Firefly at the biggest depth of discharge, bringing them down all to 20%, are still 4 times more than a flooded lead acid battery. But if you do cycle, 50%, 50%, one of them is 300, and you can either get 3,600 cycles or 4,700 cycles. Question. The question is there a difference in sizes between an AGM battery and a flooded lead acid battery? And there isn't. A group 31 is a group 31 battery. So when you buy a battery, you're going to buy it based on the size. You're going to say, I want a golf cart. A golf cart is a known dimension. You can buy a golf cart AGM or golf cart flooded, and they're exactly the same physical dimensions. So an 8D battery, for example, or a 4D battery, or a group 31 battery, all those batteries actually are known dimensions, and that you buy AGM or flooded, it doesn't matter, it's still the same size. So you can retrofit a boat that has 4 golf carts flooded, and you can replace them with 4 golf cart AGM. And they're going to be the same physical size. What happens if you replace a flooded lead acid battery with an AGM battery? Do you have to worry about the charger? Yes, you should have a charger that's compatible with AGM. A charger that is less than about 20 years old is going to have that feature. There's going to be a setting for AGM. So yes, you would. Your alternator, not so much. They want about the same thing. 14.4, 14.6. Now, if you only had an alternator and didn't have a charger, then yes, you would want to have, and we'll talk about that, an external regulator that would be configurable to AGM. I don't want to get too, that's starting geeking out. It's not storage, it's charging. We'll talk about charging a little bit later, okay? And look how much big your battery bank has to be. If you need a 200 amp hours of usable, you'll need either 600, 400, or 300, right? And that's why some people say to me, I've got sailors, racers, and they're like, for me, it's all about weight, Jeff. All about weight. Yeah, I got the space, but I don't care about the space because there's nothing in the boat. I'm racing. To me, it doesn't matter, but weight matters. Give me a battery bank that's going to do the job with the least amount of weight. And so what they'll end up doing is either Firefly, AGM for sure, because it's a way to get more energy density. Or I've been on some like crazy race boats, like the super all carbon ones, and they're doing lithium because they're measuring everything in grams. Like they know every block, everything is measured in grams. They know everything weighs. And so then they'll be very tempted to do lithium because lithium has the highest amount of energy density per weight. You can see batteries come all different sizes, and you can buy them in all different types of battery chemistries. You can even buy an 8D battery in lithium because they're trying to make it easy. It's sort of like buying lumber. You can buy a 2x4 that's made of fir, or you can make one that's made of a different material. They're just simply saying that's the shape, and now you choose what it is made of. Right? So you can buy a, for example, golf cart battery, and you can buy it as flooded or AGM or gel. You choose, right? So first you choose the physical dimensions, which is an 8D, group 31, golf cart. Then you choose the chemistry. And then back to the other question was, now should I buy a battery as a starter application, deep cycle, or dual purpose? I had an unfortunate story with a boat owner about a few years ago. He bought a battery, and it was labeled as AGM. And it was a miraculous battery. First of all, that battery was purchased in the back of a trunk of a car. So that's the first, and it came at a screaming deal of a price. So already there, you're like, wow, you're really fortunate. The guy sold the back of, that's service. Or a runaway vehicle, depends on how you see it, right? The battery was half the weight. So half the weight is half the battery. There is no other way to describe it. You're buying lead. Okay, so if your battery weighs half and it's a lead acid battery, you got half the battery. Already there, it's like, yeah, this is an 8D that weighs half the weight of normal 8Ds. I'm like, no, it's not half the weight, it's half the battery. Okay, that's already there. You don't have the full battery. And it was an AGM battery that needed to be topped off. So it was a special AGM. Sounds to me that it was a flooded lead acid battery that was really cheaply done, and it was just turnaround. It's sort of like the snake oil salesman, going from town to town. And there's no sort of like refunds because he keeps moving, and he's on the next town just selling other deals. And so you always got to remember that when you're buying a battery, you're buying lead, and lead equals capacity, and there's no shortcuts. Every boat builder knows that. Every single one, it doesn't matter who they are, they're always hitting the magic note. What happens is the boat comes for delivery, and then people want more batteries, and they just add more batteries. But what the boat was spec'd for, guaranteed every single boat that comes out of factory is meeting that requirement. 10% charge rate as a function of battery capacity. Meaning if you have a 400 amp hour deep cycle battery, you will have 10% of 400 is 40 amps. Now if you double that battery bank, suddenly the charger isn't miraculously double, it doesn't change. Still 40 amps, now you double the battery bank, you have 800 amp hours, and you still have a 40 amp battery charger, your batteries will die prematurely because you only have 5% of a charge rate. The question is, what is a reasonable charge rate for batteries? And it's going to be between 10 and 25% for flooded, and for AGM it's 10 to 40. Firefly wants a minimum of 20. Minimum 20. They can take 40 no problem as a charge rate. Lithium can take 3 times of capacity. You could have a 200 amp hour battery bank and you could put 600 amps into that battery bank. So you would charge it if it was completely empty all the way to 0, which is not. You would charge it in literally 20 minutes. That's why people love lithium, because they have a very, very high charge acceptance rate, which is CAR.
So how much would the lithium battery be?
Oh, it's big boy money. Like you can spend $8,000 for a battery, an 8D. 10 grand. Like we did a boat, 8,000 US for an 8D versus 400 flooded, 20x. But the battery is crazy. Energy density, life is 5,000 cycles. I mean, you'll never change that battery. People go offshore, they're putting lithium. They're going to be offshore 10 years. They'll never change those battery banks. They'll cycle those batteries every day. And other people do lithium because they also want to wear air conditioning. They've got like a lithium battery is a pretty miraculous battery. It doesn't matter how much you load it, it'll pretty much give you anything you need. So like catamarans that want to run air con overnight on battery banks are going to have lithium battery banks. But you got to be willing to stomach the pain at the beginning. The cost per unit is going to hurt. There's no doubt about it because the comparison is, but it's not overpriced. You're getting something different. So you can't really compare, right? It's, yeah, you spend way more money, but you're doing it for a reason. You're not doing it just a flash. It's not, you're doing it for a purpose. But most people don't need that purpose, and hence why most people don't buy lithium. It's just not required for everyone. You want to make sure your batteries are secured from moving. The other big thing is the positive and negative cables. I'm pretty big about this, and I've got just a presentation just on batteries also on the website about putting the leads at the opposite ends. Your battery bank should be in one location. Sometimes people have battery banks at different locations. You try to avoid that as much as possible. And if they are in different locations, your house battery bank, you have 4 golf carts on one side of the boat and 4 golf carts on the other, then you have to take certain precautions about that. Battery banks should be in one physical location. Now you could have multiple battery banks on your boat. You could have a thruster bank up front. You could have a house battery bank, a starter bank. That's fine. But if they're part of one bank, they need to be in one location. And this point here, keep battery connections to a minimum, goes back to, think about a car battery and think how many connections are in a car battery. There's only 2. There's a positive and a negative. Everything is distributed, right? And when you think about electrical, the people, I was not in the room, but you can see what they were thinking. They were using the word trunk lines, right? Branch circuits. They're thinking about trunk is all the current that's coming out, and it goes to a distribution one, and then from that point it goes through branch circuits, right? So they're not trying to bring everything back of the battery because it's not modular. It's not clean. A battery post is not a place where you can have 20 connections, right? It should go to a distribution point, and from a distribution point, then it fans out, okay? Example of some batteries. This is pretty popular. Like, we basically use these really sort of like, I'm a sailor and I'm always thinking capsize. And I'm always thinking you're going to be in a body of water and you're going to have side seas. And you, under no circumstances can your battery ever move on your boat. Never, ever. I don't care what happens, never. Like, the boat could be inverted and my battery banks are going to stay in place. Because you can't have that amount of weight sloshing around in a bad sea. You're going to destroy sea cocks. Things are going to get broken. It's too much weight. It's sort of like having a gorilla or a bull in your engine room. It's got to be tied down. And so you end up using these sort of like, we really beef it up. You'll see here we've got aluminum guard. I see sailboaters, they're putting wood all around. They're like thinking, what happens if I get a knockdown? You can't have the battery drop down because it's going to create a hole in the ceiling, right? You can't have something that weighs 200, 300 pounds fall 8 feet because of a knockdown. It would be end of days. The batteries have to stay in place. And if ever you see electrolyte on a battery, that's a sign of sweating, and it's either a sign of aging, overcharging, or overfilling. And it's not moisture. And that happens all the time. All the time. All of that is battery acid, and the way you neutralize it is with baking soda. This is what happens to a boat owner who's stubborn and doesn't overfill their batteries. That's the inside of a vent cap. Notice how all the plates are actually, none of this should be touching. They should all be separated. And also, once your battery bank, that plate is exposed, it's done. You lost. You can never expose your battery plates on a battery. Never. Black and white. You think you can. You're going to top it off and you're going to hope, fingers crossed, but it's going to be a journey of disappointment. It's just not going to work out for you. And I talked about battery connections at opposite ends. So one of the frequently asked questions is, can you mix and match different battery chemistries? Not within a bank, ever, right? Black and white. You can't have 2 golf carts AGM and 2 golf carts flooded connected in one battery bank. And the challenge is different batteries want different charge profiles, and we're going to talk about that later. And so you can only charge one setting on your charger. You might have 3 outputs, but you're going to have to make a decision. Which battery, sort of like having 3 kids and they all have different dietary requirements. And you got to make a compromise. You're cooking one meal. And that meal is one meal for everyone. You can't have 3 different meals for 3 kids. You're cooking one meal. So if you're cooking one meal for 3 kids, which one are you going to cook? Right? Well, then I'd say, well, if you got Firefly or AGM and that was a house battery bank and it cost you $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000 or whatever it is, then take care of those ones first and sacrifice the other ones. But that's why you want one type of battery chemistry, because chargers do not output different profiles on different charger leads, right? And your alternator, if you configure it for AGM, it's going to be AGM one output. An alternator doesn't say AGM for one bank, gel for another, and lithium for another. It says one profile, and everyone's going to have, again, one meal. You can't pick and choose. And so that's why you can't mix and match battery banks. And if you do, know that your other battery banks are not getting what they need, and they're going to have a shorter life because they're either going to be undercharged or overcharged. How would you go around there? Well, around the problem of having different battery banks of an AGM and flooded is having different chargers. So we'll see some boats where we'll have an inverter charger that is doing an AGM battery bank, and then that boat has thruster flooded, starter thrust flooded, and whatever, genset flooded, and we'll put an auxiliary charger with a flooded charge profile for those batteries, and then we'll have the inverter charger be on AGM. But then we also have to worry that there's no combiners that join the charges. They have to be completely separate. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. A cycle would be sort of a version of, a cycle for us and humans would be, for example, every time you go to bed and sleep. That's a cycle, right? That would be a cycle. So a battery means how far do you discharge, and until you start charging again, that's a cycle. So if, for example, you're on a sailboat and you move every day, your cycle would maybe, let's say you stop motoring at 4 o'clock and you don't motor again until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I know you're a sailboat and you motor, but let's be honest, certain places in the world don't sail as much as we want to, right? British Columbia being one of them. So you're motoring, and so your cycle would be that 22-hour period, and then you start recharging. Some boats, that cycle might be 3 days on the hook. Power boats too. And if you're not running a generator or an alternator, that cycle might be a 3-day cycle. And so every time you bring the cycle, that's one, and how far you go, those are the 2 levers that affect your battery life. How deep you go, and how often do you do it? Question?
What setting would you use on your EFOI for the Firefly battery?
I do either an AGM, I would probably end up doing an AGM charge profile, because AGM and Firefly are very, very similar. Very, very similar. What happens when I discharge my battery to 0? And 0 is 10.5 volts. It goes further than that, but 10.5 is the end. And that could happen when you lose shore power and you had your refrigerator on, or you left your inverter on and you lost shore power and your battery's drained. For whatever reason, your batteries went to 0, right? Which is 10.5 volts. So it's complicated because it's also a function of time. So if you brought your batteries down to 10.5 volts and you recharged them right away and they were flooded lead acid, you could do that 50 times. So you lost only 2% of capacity. It's not a big deal, right? 2%. But what happens is most of us don't realize that our batteries went to 10.5 volts the moment it gets there and we recharge them. Sometimes they're going to be discharged for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months. The longer the time between when they were at 0 and the time you recharge the batteries is going to affect your battery life. So for example, if your batteries were left discharged for a month at 0, they're done. They're finished. Now, I know you have hope. I hear it all the time. I know tell this to owners. I'm like, sure, your batteries are fine. Yeah, I know that's what you want to hear. Let's say that. Good, no problem. Let's believe. You know what? There's nothing wrong with hope. Just don't go on your vacation with hope. You know? Just do the hope thing when it doesn't matter, right? Start going boating. Maybe at the dock. Let's hope at the dock, right? When your partner's not on board or your teenager or your daughter, and they're not going to be upset when they lose the battery banks, and it's going to make boating less fun. So, but find out that discovery, you're going to find that very soon. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just go through the paces and try to pretend this is a day at the dock, which is a day at anchorage, and see what your battery voltage does. And then you'll probably realize that you're in a world of hurt. And it's painful. I mean, that happens. I hear that conversation at least 100 times a year with boaters. At least. I get it all the time. But yeah, it's about time. Think about us as, imagine you did an ultra marathon and you couldn't rest, you couldn't drink fluids, you couldn't eat, you had no way to recharge. It's a life event. If you can't rest after you've done something incredibly hard and you went to the bottom and you're literally, you fall down on the ground, pass out, and they start waking you up and you can't fall asleep and you're so tired that you want to rest, your batteries will never recuperate from that. They just won't. Now, if it happened and you're there, sure, you can recuperate. But time is of the essence. It's like going on the other side. If you die, you've got a window to come back, right? But if you're dead for a day or a week, they're not bringing you back on the other side. You're gone. And your batteries are gone too. Yeah, question? How do you know your batteries are no longer what they used to be? And that is, you know that by voltage. So that's a really great question. I get that question 200 times a year, at least. That's a great one. And they say to me, they say, Jeff, I have a battery monitor, and my battery monitor says my batteries are 80%, but my fridge stops working. Which one is right? My fridge? Like my batteries are dead, or my monitor is right? I'm like, no, your batteries are dead. If your batteries are at 10.5 volts and you're at 80% of capacity, you're done. You're finished. So voltage is a perfect tool to quantify or qualify if your batteries are still there or not. Because the two have to line up. Once your battery capacity, effective as a percentage, and your volts don't align, right? If they're completely off of whack, and again, I'm thinking about my mom, and she was, doing old school balancing the columns and the rows to see when, because she was a business owner, and seeing if the two rows and the columns, the sum of the rows and the columns didn't add up, then she knew she did a math error. If your battery capacity on your battery monitor says you're at 85% or 90%, and your batteries are at 10.5 volts, and your battery monitor was installed properly and it's always been working properly, and suddenly it doesn't make sense, that difference between those two is an indication that your batteries are dead. The question is there a simple way to know if you can test a deep cycle battery? And the answer is no, absolutely not. There is no simple way. You can do that with a cranking battery. They're called, there's two methods. You have capacitance testers, these little sort of probes, and you see techs and car mechanics do that. I've seen those so off. There's no, like I bought testers that were $1,000, $2,000. It's PFM, pure F magic. It has nothing to bear on the truth. They can be either right or wrong, so random. The only way to test a deep cycle battery is to do what's called a C20 discharge test. Again, I'm not going to bore everyone. It's on the website. I've got pretty detailed instructions. So the only way to know how long you're going to run a marathon is by running a marathon. You can maybe run 10K, but you can't sprint to know what your marathon time is going to be. You just can't. Now, a tester for starter batteries is different. They're actually just parting a carbon pile load tester. They're putting that on the battery, and they're simulating a 600 amp load by actually putting a 600 amp load, and you see what your voltage is going to do. That works, no problem. Right? That's carbon pile load tester, works great. But for deep cycle, there is no replacement. It's a C20 test. There is no other way of doing it. Other questions before break? Okay, no change of operation of the boat and the voltage goes up. Batteries don't bring voltages up. They don't. The only thing that would do that is your charger or your alternator. Generally, that's probably well underway. And your charger has failed if it's above 14.4. And it could be higher if it's temperature compensated, right? It could be higher because battery chargers are, some of them are temperature compensated, and I've seen battery chargers go to 15.2, 15.3. But if you're running your engine and you've got a typical alternator with no external regulator and the voltage is higher than normal, then you're going to cook your batteries and you're going to kill them very soon, very, very quickly. So the question is, how frequently should you bring your batteries bring them back to 100%? If they're staying around 85 and you're cruising for what frequency? I'd say ideally would be every 2 weeks, but some people do it maybe once a month. Yeah, I mean, you do what you can, right? Generally underway, you're going to make rounds. If you're doing a long day, you're going to recharge your batteries and you're going to plug in at shore power. But for people that go completely off grid, like they never charge with a charger and they don't have a generator, their batteries wear down very quickly because they end up sulfating because they don't get that 100% back. It's very hard because your alternator would have to run for so long. You'd be running that alternator at idle for so long to recharge your battery to 100% that people don't end up doing that. And so then they have to end up equalizing the batteries a lot to offset sulfation. How do you get to 100% with solar? Well, you would get to 100% with solar if, and this is a big if, your solar array outpaces your draws, right? So if you've got, like I did a big lagoon recently, we did about a 2,000 watt array. Well, that owner doesn't have a problem with getting his batteries back to 100%, right? My boat, I have a normal boat, 36-foot sailboat. I have a 450 watt array. I don't have problems to get back to 100% every single day. But the flip side is if you have a tiny array is a tiny salary. If you're working at minimum wage and you've got a lot of expenses, you're barely going to meet demand, even if you're frugal. And so there's an argument for having a large enough array that is going to offset demands within the sunny period, get you back to near 100, and then when darkness comes, then you discharge and then you repeat, right? But you need a large array to do that. Array is a large solar array, i.e. a bunch of solar panels connected. Any other questions before we go for break? And I'm probably going to have to call break because, yeah, go ahead. You wouldn't need, the question is, can you equalize with an alternator? And you can, and only if you have an alternator with an external regulator, and that external regulator has an equalization mode. But a typical alternator will never give you equalization. Equalization is a very high voltage. And honestly, equalization is going to be a side topic for sure, because let's be honest, it doesn't apply to most of us. It's only very few, not even 5% of people will ever equalize, not even. I don't mind talking about it, but this sideline. So with that, we'll take maybe a 10-minute break, and then we'll regroup afterwards. All right, thank you.